I visited some folks in Bolivia that had been participating in this 10-year program, which was really around supporting sustainable forestry efforts in Bolivia. And I was there to do sort of an impact evaluation of this 10-year program with a couple of colleagues. And so we were interviewing folks, and they were saying to us, like, we went to all your workshops. We showed up. You all kept inviting us to come to the city and learn new skills. But in reality, if you could have actually worked with us to get our forest or our wood certified and then helped us find buyers for that wood, that's what would have actually helped us. And I think there were some efforts around trying to do that, but I just think it could have been much more directly done. And if we had started with the question of what are you looking to do, they probably would have said increase our income. And then we could have said all right, let's come up with a way to increase your income, not just let's do skill building for the sake of skill building. To me, a human-centered design approach to that would have started with conversations around what was it that they wanted and needed, combine that with whatever sort of climate outcomes that we might have wanted to see, and then said, how can we work with you to find a path forward that generates more income and ensures these climate-friendly practices.
Welcome to Cause and Purpose, the show about the leaders, innovators, and change agents working on the front lines to solve some of the world's greatest social challenges. I'm Mike Spear, and our guest today is Jocelyn Wyatt, CEO of Alight, one of the world's most innovative humanitarian aid organizations. When it comes to reimagining how we serve displaced communities, few people have had as much influence as Jocelyn. Her journey from USAID contractor to pioneering human-centered design and humanitarian aid at IDEO.org to leading a $90 million global humanitarian organization serving 4 million people annually around the world is a masterclass in how the important work of serving vulnerable communities can and should be done. Over the past 25 years, Jocelyn has challenged the fundamental assumptions about how aid should work. She's helped transform reproductive health and contraceptive delivery in Africa. She co-founded IDEO.org, where she brought design thinking to social impact at scale. And now at Alight, she's proving that treating refugees as customers rather than mere beneficiaries isn't just more dignified, it's more effective. Today, we're diving deep into what it really means to center power with local leadership, why optimism is a strategic imperative in humanitarian work, and how Alight is navigating our extremely challenging geopolitical climate while continuing to serve people in some of the world's most challenging places. We'll also explore Jocelyn's insights from the field, from Bolivia's forests to Kenya's health clinics to Sudan's war zones, and what she's learned about creating lasting change in complex environments. Our conversation gets to the heart of what 21st century humanitarian work should look like, whether you're working in global development, running a nonprofit, or simply care about how we respond to some of the growing crises around the world. Jocelyn's perspectives can challenge how you think about impact, innovation, and the power of proximity. Jocelyn, thanks so much for joining us. I'm really excited to learn more about you and your story and talk about your work in the impact sector.
Thanks so much. So happy to be here.
There are so many places that we could start, but I always want to start with why. What was it that caused you to want to be in the impact sector and take the career trajectory that you did?
I grew up to two parents that were both educators. My dad worked in higher education and fundraising. My mom was a teacher. And I wanted to sort of follow in that path of sort of doing a career with impact. My parents had also both lived and worked abroad, and my grandparents had been avid travelers as well. And so I was really curious about the world, which led me to study anthropology in undergrad. And as I was graduating my senior year, I met with my advisor and said, I really want a job where I can have social impact and travel internationally. And he recommended that I go into global development and pursue options in DC, which is what I did. Started off right after undergrad, working for a USAID contractor in DC. And I felt like I did have the opportunity pretty immediately to be able to do good in the world, and also certainly had opportunities to do quite a bit of travel really all over the world.
I'm curious about anthropology as a major. Was that strategic? Have you used lessons learned in that education throughout your career? Or was that just something you were interested in and, fun to do?
I think it was more at the time something that I was interested in. I think I was really curious about other cultures and wanted to understand people and people from different places in the world. And so I studied it more as a curiosity, I would say. I went to Grinnell College in Iowa undergrad, and I think they did a good job of helping us recognize the transferable skills, particularly around qualitative research. And so that certainly was helpful to me in terms of both in terms of sort of development work and just understanding that like our own cultural specificities that we may hold or these that we should recognize what are cultural assumptions that may be making us think that something should be one way or another way. I think that anthropology really helps you question those. And then I think, particularly as I went into the field of design, having that sort of toolkit around qualitative research was really helpful for that work at IDEO. And I think just generally to continue to build this cultural curiosity, it's helped make the work that I've done for the past 25 years or so even more sort of rich and interesting.
Let's talk about USAID. I mean, it's been in the news quite a bit lately for obvious reasons. I've been aware of them for a long time, and they have a tremendous legacy. And I think as the years went on, they gained a ton of credibility and started having some real deep impact. But there were some lessons learned in the early days where maybe they made a few mistakes. I'm curious, when you joined them as a contractor, what surprised you? Like, what sorts of projects were you working on, and what did you learn about the sector through that early experience?
I was working for a large for-profit contractor, and there was a wide range of projects that we were working on. At the time, we were doing a lot of work, sort of build the private sector in Jordan. We were working with sort of help build the legal system in Egypt and doing work in forestry in Bolivia. I think what was most surprising for me and ultimately sort of what made me decide to sort of pursue work in the kind of development space, but to take maybe a different take on it, was that it did feel like there were a few hundred of us sitting in Washington making decisions about what a Bolivian farmer might need, or a Jordanian entrepreneur, or an Egyptian journalist. And our own lived realities were so different from that of the people that we were designing these programs for. There was just such a disconnect between the proposals that we were writing in Washington and then when you actually had the opportunity to spend time with folks in Jordan or Egypt or Bolivia, like the programs that we were designing were not necessarily connected with the things that they wanted and needed. And so after about 5 years there, it was a great education in terms of understanding how the whole foreign aid system worked, how USAID was making decisions, how contractors were making decisions. And I certainly had many experiences getting to visit different programs and meet people from all over the world. But I just felt like there must be a different or better way to really design programs and to really help improve situations and tackle poverty alleviation in these other places that was much more grounded in the lived experience and the sort of proximate leadership of folks that were from these places. And that I didn't feel like I was well positioned at age 23 sitting in DC to be designing these like massive multi-year, multi-million dollar programs.
I think it's a pitfall that's fairly common in the sector, especially before human-centered design became so much a part of the conversation. Can we dive a little bit deeper into that for just a second? I'm curious, what you experienced as the impact of that disconnect in the field versus some of the things you experienced later where you were taking a more human-centered design approach to things.
I remember I visited some folks in Bolivia that had been participating in this 10-year program, which was really around supporting sustainable forestry efforts in Bolivia. And I was there to do sort of an impact evaluation of this 10-year program with a couple of colleagues. And so we were interviewing folks and they were saying to us, like, we went to all your workshops. We showed up. You all kept inviting us to like come to the city and learn new skills. But in reality, if you could have actually worked with us to get our forests or our wood certified, and then helped us find buyers for that wood, like that's what would have actually helped us. And I think there were some efforts around trying to do that, but I just think it could have been much more directly done. And if we had started with the question of what are you looking to do, they probably would have said increase our income. And then we could have said like, all right, let's come up with a way to increase your income, not just let's do skill building for the sake of skill building in the hopes that maybe someday that skill building will be useful in you certifying. And maybe then you'll find a buyer and then maybe then you'll generate more income. So I think it just, to me, like a human-centered design approach to that would have started with those conversations with those folks managing those forests around what was it that they wanted and needed. combine that with whatever sort of climate outcomes that we might
Mm.
have wanted to see, and then said, like, how can we work with you to like find a path forward that generates more income and ensures these climate friendly practices?
I don't know what to describe this as. A hiatus, an adventure. You spent several years, it sounds like, in Kenya and in India working in the field with beneficiaries of these programs. Tell me a little bit about that experience and what you learned from being so proximate, from engaging with them so directly.
Yeah, so I left DC after about 5 years to go to business school, and I thought was that I wanted to continue to do sort of work in the global development space, but wanting to sort of see if maybe the private sector had other ways of
Mm.
doing it, that wasn't quite as top down or might just sort of be oriented a bit differently. And so once I got to business school, I went to Thunderbird to study international business and learned pretty quickly about social entrepreneurship and social enterprise. And the idea being, if we can start sort of business-based solutions that they both will be sort of local entrepreneurs that benefit from starting these businesses, but also that it gives people more voice and power as customers to be able to say, like, yes, I want to go to this health clinic or I want to pay for this water delivery business. So, in between my first and second years of business school, I decided to do an extended internship in India with an organization called Vision Spring. So, Vision Spring had started a few years earlier, and they were working with a network of they're calling vision entrepreneurs to sell affordable eyeglasses, particularly reading glasses, to older people that lived across rural India. I joined Vision Spring as an MBA intern, and after a month or two, the country director left, and they asked me to step in and become the interim country director, which I did and stayed basically another 8 or 9 months until I found my successor and got him up to speed and turned it over to him. But I think for me, it was a really good example of what it did look like to create business opportunities that really did meet a pretty profound social need. And then after I was graduating from business school, I ended up connecting with Acumen that had started a few years before. They were launching a global fellowship program, which I applied for and was able to join the first class of global fellows at Acumen. So there I worked with a couple different social entrepreneurs that were doing health related businesses in East Africa. One was working with a network of nurse owned health clinic franchises across Kenya. And the other was a company that was working to locally produce artemisinin for malaria treatments in East Africa. So both of them, again, really interesting experiences. I think I really got to see up close what the sort of both the challenges and opportunities were for entrepreneurs in Kenya, what it was like to work in that context, what the sort of real social needs were to be addressed, but also really how to build and scale a business or social enterprise in that context.
Was there a part of you that wanted to come back and just start like a for-profit business after that experience?
At the time, I didn't really think about that. I was really interested in scaling businesses or in thinking about these businesses. After 3 years of being outside of the US, I was ready to be back and closer to family. But I definitely got the entrepreneurial energy from them and I think, kept that through my time going into IDEO and ultimately starting IDEO.org.
What did ultimately bring you to IDEO? Was it just being a fan of their work, or what was the opportunity there for you?
So when I was an Acumen Fellow, part of the orientation was a 3-day design thinking workshop that the CEO of IDEO at the time, Tim Brown, and another IDEO partner led for the Acumen Global Fellows in New York. And I remember thinking like, wow, this is fascinating. This is like everything that I've been thinking about in terms of like how we could be solving problems differently, but I never had sort of the words to put towards it. And so then I was just really interested in the work at IDEO. I read a lot about it. I read the books during that year when I was a fellow. And about the time the fellowship program was starting to wrap up, I reached out to Jacqueline Novogratz, who was a great mentor of mine and
Mhm.
the founder and CEO of Acumen, and sort of said, like, and thinking about what's next. And she happened to be actually at TED at that time with Tim, and basically said to him, like, hey, you have anything for Jocelyn? And he had actually been with Jacqueline on a trip to India when I was running Vision Spring there. And so I had gotten to meet both of them at that time. And so Tim knew me both from that context in India, as well as that design thinking workshop that he ran for the fellows. And he was like, actually, we are looking to really sort of invest in a social impact practice. And said that he'd be interested in talking with me about helping to get that started at IDEO. And so I had an initial conversation with Tim, and I said to him, like, I just want to be clear, like, I'm not a designer. I don't have a background as a designer. And so this would really be new for me. And he was basically like, well, we have 600 people here who know a lot about design, but nobody that really knows about the social impact space. So we're really interested in learning from you. And so if you're up for coming here and teaching us about that, we'd be up for teaching you about design. So it was definitely a big learning curve at the beginning, sort of learning more about design and how to speak that language, how to do those projects, how to really add value using human-centered design to social impact organizations. But really tremendous opportunity to build that practice within the company initially.
What's an example for people that might not be following IDEO as closely as you and I have in the past, particularly you? But what's a good example or some favorite projects that you worked on there?
Yeah. So at the beginning, we had gotten some funding from Gates Foundation to partner with Acumen on sort of exploring different social enterprise models for access to water for families in Kenya and India. And so it was great. Like, we were able to partner with a number of different sort of local emerging social enterprises to design like businesses to deliver water to customers' front doors, to set up water kiosks for people to come and gather water on a daily basis, to combine access to water with access to different types of other products, basic kiosks with health and beauty products. So there's a number of projects in that space. We also did a lot of work in the sanitation space. So we were looking again at affordable access to clean sanitation for families. And then ended up doing a lot of work in the space of adolescent reproductive health with some larger INGOs like Murray Stopes and PSI, DKT. And there we were really working on the question of how do we improve the access and uptake of contraception, particularly to adolescent girls in East Africa. And so there it was really about working to address the stigma that existed in terms of everyone was talking to them about family planning. And these young girls were like, we're not looking to start families. I don't want to plan a family. And even just the words that were being used, or these adolescent girls didn't want to go into the health clinics where they might run into their moms or their moms' friends or their aunts. And through that design research, understanding what those needs were of the girls, and then designing those services and communications in a way that would really resonate with that. There's a lot of work that we did at IDEO.org around that.
I'm curious, what was the innovation there that sort of unlocked the participation and the impact for that one? I got to spend some time years ago in Lesotho at Kick for Life and Grassroots Soccer, who are using sports to do what you're talking about, talk about sexual health and contraception and things like that. They're doing it in the context of a game, which is, for that population, very effective. So I'm curious, what was the learning that sort of unlocked that program at IDEO for you guys?
Yeah, I think there were a few things, just shifting the communications to be much more oriented around adolescents, whether that was shifting terms like family planning. We did a project in Zambia, for instance, and we created these characters called the Divine Divas. So the divas were these kind of cartoon characters representing different forms of contraception. And so we really just humanized them. And then they took on these personas so that girls could really understand like why they might be somebody that might want an IUD versus a pill versus an implant. I think another was that we actually created sort of girl safe spaces that were really designed for those adolescent girls. And so sometimes they were connected to a larger clinic, sometimes they were standalone. But those spaces had like fashion mags in them and nail polish, and were just like fun social spaces in addition to being places that a girl might be able to get those services. in a number of the programs, we ended up doing a lot of events. And so they would be like fashion shows and talent shows and other sort of community events that would bring people out. And then there would be this sort of like undercurrent around health services and contraception and reproductive health. But that wasn't really the main driver. The main driver was really about bringing girls together, led by girls, for these sort of bigger community programs that then facilitated these inroads into the services. We created a board game in West Africa that could be used to really engage couples in conversations about contraception decisions. I think a lot of it was just about making it more playful and fun and accessible and really using the language of the people that it was meant for, as opposed to making it seem so medicalized and inaccessible and like this really undesirable thing.
When you're making innovative changes, do you formally sort of come up with a scientific method around it, test it, or is it more like, this seems like a good idea, and then sort of monitoring the impact of it after the fact?
The design thinking process is really about starting with that research and those insights, doing the kind of brainstorming and iteration and coming up with those concepts, and then testing really early stage prototypes to really get a sense of what's working, what's not working, what's resonating, what's not. And then sort of evolving those prototypes into higher and higher resolution, ultimately into pilots that then can be sort of measured, where you can actually look at the outcomes of that. But one example was like we were prototyping, like, how do we reach these girls, and like how can we start to engage them in conversations? And my colleagues, the design team that was working on this project, went out to a club like on a Saturday night or something in Lusaka. And these Zambian design researchers were like trying to engage these young women like in the bathrooms at this nightclub and these conversations about the contraception. And like nobody wanted to like talk about, like in
Sure.
retrospect, it was like such a terrible idea. But like,
Right.
you could see how the idea came from like a brainstorm of people like, where are girls? Well, they're in nightclubs. Like, well, then let's go and find them in nightclubs. And then like ultimately the idea sort of shifted to like basically having these sort of pop-up nail salons and like giving girls manicures and then like being able to engage in conversations about relationships and contraception, well, doing a manicure, which was like a much more appropriate like time and place to like do that rather than the nightclub. But it was really through prototyping that we were able to have a better understanding of like how we might engage these girls more effectively.
That's funny. I'm just picturing the scenario. You're just trying to wash your hands and get back to the party, and someone comes up, hey, can we talk about...
Exactly. No, thank you. Not the time.
Amazing. If I've got this story right, while you were at IDEO, you started working on a project called the Sealy with the then called American Refugee Coalition.
Yeah, even before that. So in 2010, what is now Alight, which was American Refugee Committee, approached us at IDEO and said, hey, we are looking to become a different organization. Like, we really want to reinvent what a 21st century humanitarian organization looks like. And we want your help in helping us figure out the path to get there. And so the first project that we took on with ARC at the time, now Alight, was actually about how to engage the Somali diaspora in the Twin Cities, which is where the headquarters of ARC was, how to engage the Somali diaspora in humanitarian efforts, ultimately to support Somalia. And we ended up designing sort of a program and a campaign called Neighbors for Nations, which really was about bridging this cultural divide in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area to really help the sort of longtime residents be able to both understand and celebrate the culture of their new Somali neighbors, and for the Somalis to really be able to understand like what was the new place that they had moved into and how could they get to meet and connect with their neighbors and show off what it was that they brought culturally as well. And then that sort of led to sort of a fundraising campaign off the back of that called I'm a Star, which we designed with ARC at IDEO.org, which was really about sort of a diaspora-led fundraising effort to address the famine in the Horn of Africa. So this was in 2011, where we're seeing massive famine in that part of the world, in Ethiopia and Somalia, Kenya. And so developed this campaign in particular for the Somali diaspora community to really be the ones taking the lead to raise funding and support for the famine efforts. And then, over time, we did many different projects. There was about a dozen years that I was at IDEO and IDEO.org that we collaborated with ARC and ultimately Alight, and we actually did the rebrand for the organization from ARC to Alight in 2018, 2019.
What made you want to take the jump from running IDEO.org, which I imagine was fairly exciting at the time, to taking on this new challenge?
By the time I left in 2021, I've been in between IDEO and IDEO.org for about 14 years. I'd co-founded IDEO.org about 10 years before. And so feeling like at this kind of somewhat natural transition point of having led it for a decade, I wasn't really actively looking, but I was starting to think about what might be next in terms of my own learning journey and career. And I was interested in running a bigger organization and really sort of taking what I had done at IDEO.org and really, finding an organization where I could sort of implement it even more deeply
Mm.
within an organization that was itself like delivering services, running programs, having direct impact. And I don't think I would have worked for most INGOs. I think there were very few organizations that I would have chosen to go to, but I really did feel like from everything that I had seen that Alight was different. I was very close to the organization at that point and knew a number of members of the leadership team and some of the board. And what I was seeing in boardroom conversations and executive team conversations was that the organization was really consistently centering their decisions on the displaced people, the refugees that they were serving. And whereas most other organizations, though they were giving lip service to this customer centricity, in reality, when you would hear board members or executives of many of the INGOs talk, it's really about their donors and what they were doing in order to raise more money. And of course, that's critical for us, any of us, to be able to deliver on our mission. But I just think that, many of them were sort of missing the point, I thought, and kind of saw their job as like being in business to stay in business as opposed to being in business to really deliver on their mission or serve their customers. And so, I think, I was at a point where I was looking for kind of a new challenge, and Alight really felt like the organization that was delivering on one of the values that I really believed in.
Yeah. You mentioned a few things I want to dive deeper on, but I think we should just pause for a second and just tell people, what is Alight? What does it do? What's the scope? What is the reach? What's it all about?
Yeah, so Alight is an international humanitarian nonprofit organization. We've been around for nearly 50 years. Our focus is really on supporting, working with, and walking alongside refugees. So we work with people that have been forcibly displaced due to conflict or climate or severe economic or social exclusion. We work in about 20 countries around the world and serve about 4 million people a year. We've got 2,500 staff at Alight who deliver those services. So we do things like we run health clinics in Sudan and nutrition feeding centers. We run reception centers for refugees in Uganda, at this point, mainly folks coming in from Congo. We run education programs. We're running higher education programs for Afghan girls in Pakistan. We are working in Ukraine on providing psychosocial support and trauma care and doing some home rebuilding for families in Ukraine and Poland. Sort of wide range of the types of work that we do, everything from basic kind of survival, health clinics, nutrition, water and sanitation, shelter, through education, job opportunities, entrepreneurship, resettlement, and community integration.
I'm curious just to start with, what was that transition like for you? Going from a relatively not small, 75 people at IDEO.org, to something with 2,500 staff in 20 countries around the world.
Yeah.
For you as a leader, what was that transition like? What surprised you about it? How'd you have to change how you operate to adjust to that sort of scale and complexity?
Yeah, in some ways, it was a pretty smooth transition, I think, because I knew the organization pretty well. And I think, fortunately, I entered a really kind and welcoming culture. They wanted me to succeed. They wanted me to understand it. They're happy to have me there. So that felt really nice. It was definitely sort of leadership and management at a scale that I had not operated at before. And I think the humanitarian context, though I had touched it at IDEO.org, I did not have a depth of expertise in the refugee space or the humanitarian field. So it was a pretty big learning curve in terms of what I had to get to understand and to know the sector, really.
Mm.
The war in Ukraine happened about 3 months into my time at Alight.
Mm.
And we decided pretty immediately to jump in and to start up operations there to provide support. I think that was a really helpful education for me because I got to see what did it look like at day one, what happens in the first hours, and then like how do things evolve from there. And so I had, a pretty good front row seat for that, which was really helpful. I think many of the same sort of leadership lessons apply in terms of leading a board and an executive team and keeping everybody sort of aligned. But I started off with kind of a 90-day plan and a listening tour. My first 6 months or so, I visited most of the countries where Alight works. Felt like it was really important to get to spend time on the ground with our customers, with our frontline staff, with the leadership of our country operations. So that was really pretty consuming for the first 6 months or so. And then that kind of dovetailed into a strategy process to really say, okay, what's our North Star? What are we really headed for? What are we trying to do here? And so it was helpful to both have that context from having visited the places that we were to really help that inform the strategy.
Doing a listening tour like that, I'm sure for a lot of leaders would be prohibitive or at least a luxury. How was it for you as part of your journey taking on this organization? And what did you learn that really helped shape your strategy moving forward?
It felt really important for me to be grounded in the places that we work and connected with the people that we work with. I think one of the things that really stood out for me was how deeply entrenched Alight's values were in our staff, from like drivers and guards all the way through the executive directors. And I just hear people reference our values in a way that was just very natural. And it made me recognize that the values really has come from the way in which this culture operated. And they were not just these like top down posters. I think I also recognized that while the values were this uniting force within the organization, that people really were looking for a strategy. They were really looking for a bit more direction to say, no, this is the type of work that we're doing to advance the mission of this organization. I think prior to that, the different enterprises were doing really important work, but it wasn't necessarily under a coherent frame. And so I think it felt a bit disjointed to people. And so I think pretty quickly, that's when I realized, oh, we need to do a strategy process to get everyone oriented, not just to like who we are, which I think we had a very good sense of, but what does this organization do?
But it sounds like they were pretty open to transformation there. And in addition to just welcoming you to the org, they were looking for you to make some pretty fundamental changes, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can we talk a little bit more about the importance of culture, especially in impact organizations, and some of the ways that you instill the values into the culture so they're more than just words on a wall, that they're really present in everybody's everyday work?
To me, it's like the culture and the purpose are pretty deeply entrenched, or probably should be, in most impact organizations. I think there have certainly been times when I've seen impact organizations lose their way in terms of purpose and culture. And what winds up happening is that the employees really think that, like, at the end of the day, the job of the organization is to provide like great employment opportunities to them.
Yeah,
And I
right.
think like the same way that like shareholder value can become like really the preeminent concern of for-profits, I think in nonprofits, like employee experience can really become like the driving factor without a real clear sense of sort of purpose that is, upheld by culture. And so I think in Alight, what I really appreciated when I came was that there was a very strong sense of purpose in terms of our purpose is serving displaced communities, walking alongside displaced communities and refugees, and that the values really were underpinning the culture, and the way that we operated was through this set of values. And the brand, I think, was just the representation or articulation of that in many ways. And so for us, one of our values is to choose optimism, another is to find others, another is to start with giving. And so like we wanted to be the organization that orients towards yes, right? That we want to always operate with abundance, that we believe that beauty matters. And so I think that really has changed the way that we look and feel and operate, and that's what we celebrate. And I think this organization has done a really good job of celebrating and validating and really providing opportunities for individuals in particular that really represent that culture. And I think culture does live in people more than anything else. And so I think part of it, and I think part of what we've done well at Alight is to really retain and promote and support and celebrate and uplift the individuals here that are the ones that are the real cultural champions that continue to show us what it looks like to uphold those values every day.
I love the values book, by the way, the little workbook. I thought that was very cool. You mentioned optimism. Let's talk a little bit about that. It's one of the core values, but I feel like for you and for Alight, it's really a core strategic component as well. And it strikes me as powerful and interesting and unique, especially because the populations you're dealing with, refugees, are by definition in some pretty terrible situations. So I guess the question is, how have you operationalized the optimism piece, and what does it do for the organization and the work?
I think that for us, a belief in abundance as opposed to scarcity is where it started. And my predecessor really talked about everyone has something to give, whether you are a refugee with a change of clothes on your back or you are a billionaire. Everyone has something to give, and everyone should be able to give those gifts. And what sort of comes out of that is that we live in an abundant world full of people that want to give and want to contribute. I think if you believe in that, then that optimism is just sort of part of that, right? That like we believe that people are good, and ultimately that we believe that people want to be good and want opportunities to be good. And so therefore, like, we're going to believe in people, right? So I think that's sort of where it comes from. I think what it looks like is that we do orient to saying yes over saying no. And that's the sort of like belief in abundance over scarcity, that we want to be sort of a culture that supports emergence, that if people have ideas or things they want to try or things they want to do differently, like we really want to say yes, because we believe that there can be a better way. We don't need to continue doing things the way that we have. All of that is part of it, is this like belief in the possibility of a better world. And that if we can give people what it is that they want and need, that they can help make that happen.
I imagine it's very helpful just from a morale perspective for folks working in the field, but
Yeah.
I also feel like it must translate to the customers in terms of like their own resilience and their ability to capitalize on the services that you're offering them.
Yeah, absolutely. What we hear a lot from our customers is that it is different, their interactions with Alight, than it is with many of the other INGOs. I think we really do look people in the eyes and we call them by their names and we treat them as individual people, as opposed to like another number of person that we are delivering health services to, or a jerry can of water to. And I think a lot of what we do is we ask them for their feedback. How are we doing? How can we be better? And we really listen to that and we engage them in those conversations. And this sort of leads us into the co-creation work that Alight does, which is really about believing that people that are more proximate to the challenges really do have answers and do have solutions and know really what's best for themselves, their families, and their communities. And so I think that just means that we orient differently towards our customers, rather than thinking that we have this like obligation to serve or to deliver in this sort of militarized way. And the service delivery point is a point of interaction, as a point of relationship, as a point of connection. And so we should be engaging with our customers in a really thoughtful way in those moments.
Even the word customer strikes me as interesting. I'm trying to think if I've heard it at all elsewhere in the space, but generally maybe clients. But why are you so deliberate about that word and intentional about that word? And what does it open up for you guys in terms of culture and how you perceive the beneficiaries of the programs and how they perceive you?
Yeah, we are really intentional about using the word customer, and it really is because we want people to feel that they have choice, that they have choice to visit the clinic that we're running or to participate in the job program that we're offering. And we really want to hold ourselves accountable to thinking that they have that choice and to really deliver in a way that if they were paying, that they would choose to pay for the services that we're offering. I think so often it's easy as INGOs to let yourself off the hook and kind of say like, well, this donor is paying, so we're just going to deliver for these people. They're the beneficiaries of that support. And whatever happens here, like just that's what it is. They should be grateful that there's something rather than nothing. And we're doing what we can with the funding that we have, right? And instead, I think our orientation is just a bit different, which is hey, we're working here alongside these folks. We are here together figuring out how we can make this experience
Hmm.
as great as it possibly can be. Of course, there are constraints in terms of funding and resources and security and all the rest, but we're together going to make the most of that. And we're going to keep asking the people that we are in community with their ideas and how we can get better. And then we're going to hold ourselves accountable to getting better.
Alight annual budget, a little under 90 million, 4 million people a year in the programs, 20 countries involving the customers in the design process. How do you avoid mission creep? It must be so tempting to start doing things reactively or based on certain signals or feedback you get that would distract from the mission. How do you guys stay so focused around the value that you're delivering to people and manage that sort of tension or back and forth?
Yeah, having the grant funding to be able to allow us to do what we do is really critically important. And so that does mean that there are some geographies that we will ramp up in or step away from based on where there are funding opportunities. That's just like the
Hmm.
way that our businesses are set up. And same with different sectors, right? And so that said, though, I think what has been important for us is to really put a definition around who we're serving. I think when we first were founded, the focus was really refugees. So people were crossing borders. And I think over time that really expanded from serving refugees to displaced people, which means also people that are internally displaced, to someone that
Hmm.
was lived in one part of Sudan and then had to move to a different part of Sudan, right? Internally
Hmm.
displaced people. Then there sort of was some period of time when I think we started to creep out of that and look to work in sort of fragile contexts, right? So we were looking at how might we prevent displacement or work in environments where there was perhaps conflict or even sort of natural disasters, but that wasn't necessarily leading to displacement. And as
Hmm.
part of our strategy, what I felt like was important was to recenter on displacement, both refugees and internally displaced, but that there was something unique about people that had been forcibly made to leave their homes. Both needed that emergency support at the beginning, needed support during those transition periods as they found their way, and then needed that support to rebuild their lives and seek their futures in the new homes or return back home. So we've really held ourselves to that, which I think has been helpful. But then we still do have quite a bit of leeway in terms of the sort of suite of services that we provide and the geographies in which we're working.
How responsive are you to funders? That's a dialogue, I think, always. But what's your philosophy in accepting grants for things that might be a little bit mission creep or a little bit parallel to your work versus conversations with those funders about redirecting their initial intent? What's the balance there that you've found for Alight?
A lot of what we have really invested in for the last decade is around centering power with our executive directors. So our executive directors are the ones that they run the enterprises. So that we have an executive director for Sudan. So sometimes it's on a country basis,
Hmm.
sometimes it's a region. We have an executive director for Horn of Africa, for instance.
And all those folks are local, right, to those regions?
Yeah, exactly. All those folks are local. And we really believe that they are the ones that know best, like the work that we should be doing in those contexts. So we actually have really not limited that. And we also believe that, like, it's best if they are and can be entrepreneurial and find opportunities. And who am I to say that something is or is not on mission or on strategy in Sudan versus like Idris, who is from Sudan, lives there every day, really knows the situation. And I think instead of having this kind of top down control and saying, no, we're not doing this, or no, we're going to redirect this, we really put that power and control in the hands of our executive directors to say, hey, you all know best. Here's the overarching
Hmm.
strategy. Build a portfolio of programmatic work that fits within that. And I trust you that whatever you do is going to be coherent and make sense and going to be related to the needs that people have.
So you mentioned some of your work in Sudan. It's so hard to keep up with the news these days with everything going on, and the Israeli-Palestine conflict has sort of dominated. I think a lot of people aren't really as aware of the new issues in Sudan that have started to pop up recently. What's going on in the Sudan at this point, and what is the work that Alight is doing in that region?
Yeah, the ongoing conflict in Sudan, which has now been, a few years, is really one of the most severe humanitarian crises today. There's about 25 million people that require humanitarian assistance in Sudan, people that really need food and healthcare. More than 10 million have been displaced internally, and in addition, 4 million displaced across borders. 14 million people that have had to forcibly leave their homes and are living in pretty unstable environments, either within Sudan or most of them in neighboring countries outside of Sudan. Resources are really stretched. We are and have been for a number of years at this point. The banking systems aren't working. People don't really have employment. The country is in a state of war. And then recently, what we've seen, particularly in Darfur, is a pretty bad security situations and pretty atrocious sort of humanitarian context for folks. And so this sort of heightened fear and security situation is making the sort of humanitarian context and things like access to food and healthcare even more challenging.
What does success look like for you guys in a country like Sudan?
Right now, I think what we're really trying to do is to provide that life-saving support to families that need it most. And so we are operating health clinics, nutrition feeding centers in Darfur and really across the country of Sudan. We've been operating in Sudan for more than 20 years, and so we've seen different cycles of what has happened in terms of peace and conflict within the country. And we've more than 1,000 staff that are serving over 2 million people annually in Sudan. We hope that there can be peace in Sudan, and ultimately our work can then be to help people get back to their homes and their communities and rebuild houses and get kids into school and help people find job opportunities and start businesses and get that stability, welcome people back in West Sudan and back into the country. But until there's a peace and there's political agreements at a higher level, right now our work is to really provide that sort of life-saving support and to work really closely with all actors in this conflict to ensure that we are able to operate health clinics, that we're able to feed starving and malnourished children, that we're able to provide the sort of psychosocial support and gender-based violence protection and child protection services. And it helps provide some level of stability in a context where the government is just not able to do that because of this war.
It seems like an incredibly challenging place to operate, especially these days. How is your infrastructure there? I'm curious, you've been there for a while, and Sudan is one of those places that seems like it's always facing some sort of crisis like this. How's Alight's infrastructure? Do you guys have to ramp up anew when something happens, or are you pretty entrenched and adapt as things evolve?
Yeah, because we've been there for so long, we had pretty good bases of operations. Prior to this war, our team was predominantly centralized in Khartoum, though we were working in both Darfur and we were working in the eastern part of Sudan, particularly since the crisis with Tigray and Tigrayans started to leave Ethiopia and come into Sudan. But since the war, we haven't really been able to operate out of Khartoum because it was so insecure. Now we do have some folks back in Khartoum, but we opened up a base in Port Sudan, which is where many other organizations are operating from. So Port Sudan is in the east, and we're able to get supplies into Port Sudan and then distribute them from there. But it was starting to become increasingly challenging to cross the entire country from Port Sudan and go into the RSF controlled areas to Darfur, for instance. And so then we were operating with a base as well in South Sudan. And so we were able to get goods from South Sudan into Darfur. But then with tensions and sort of political instability in South Sudan, that became a bit more tenuous as well. So we recently opened up a hub in Chad. So we're able to now access Sudan from Port Sudan, from South Sudan, and from Chad. And so having each of those three supply chain routes has been really helpful for us, both in terms of being able to get goods in for the health clinics and the feeding centers and to provide food, but also from a security standpoint. So depending on where things are tense or where roads are blocked, we're able to access from different directions.
So complex challenge.
Very,
It
and
requires
super complex, and having to navigate that situation, especially this year, we were in this weird position of we were experiencing these foreign aid cuts and looking at consolidation, but then also seeking board approval to start operations out of Chad. But it wasn't as if we were looking to expand our geographic footprint, but we just needed to be able to get goods into another route so that we could continue serving, particularly the Darfur region of Sudan.
What's that process like when you determine, for whatever reason, Sudan or elsewhere, that you need to fire up a new hub and start operations from scratch? What's that like for you guys? What's the process there?
Yeah, generally we start with an assessment and like really try and find local partners. Our first move is just to see like who's on the ground there, who can we work well with, who can we operate through, and then do a legal scan to understand what does it look like to register. And that's really done in collaboration between folks here at our hub in Minneapolis and our CFO, for instance, or our supply chain team, along with the sort of in-country Sudanese leadership. And we also have a hub in Nairobi. So Nairobi and Minneapolis are sort of our two global hubs. And so we have logistics and supply chain people and advisors and finance people. And so they look at that. And then ultimately, in this case, it was a decision that the board had to approve. Our board is fantastic, very supportive, and they had really been tracking the humanitarian crisis in Sudan with us for a long time. And we're very committed about doing what needed to be done. And we were able to, we had enough funding through the grants that we had to be able to cover the operational costs of that, but basically shared with them, like, here's where we are and here's why we think this is necessary, and got their approval to be able to open up that supply hub in Chad.
I imagine that security is a real big concern too, that you need to invest in.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And this was a way to really protect our people from having to cross through the center of the country. Instead, they could go another way.
It's interesting. Organizations doing stuff here in the States, I think, can take for granted, hey, we can open a new office or open a hub or hire a few people. But like in some of these regions, there's just so much more support that has to go around it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's zoom out a little bit. I'm curious, with so much complexity and so many different programs and staff all over the place, how does Alight measure its impact? I'm curious about your top KPIs and the balance. It must be so tempting to measure everything, report on all kinds of impact metrics, but how do you decide like what's in and what's out in terms of areas to focus on?
Yeah, I think for us, we do serve large numbers of people. We are serving 4 million people a year, and that number ebbs and flows, depends on where we're working and the work that we're doing. But we certainly track those reach numbers and have dashboards that show like these are the number of people that we're serving through our health work or through our protection work or water sanitation work. This is how many people we're serving in different geographies. This is how many men, women, children we're serving. That's the sort of like the reach numbers. Ultimately, though, our goal isn't to be the largest organization that we can, serving the most number of people. I think there's many other organizations that aim to do that. I don't think that's really the winning strategy for us. I think for us, what is more important is that we are able to design innovative programs and new solutions to address humanitarian crises. Our ambition is more around showcasing or demonstrating what it really looks like to be a 21st century humanitarian organization, what it really means to like hold our customers at the center, what it means to co-create with customers that based on deep insights, what high quality services and implementation really look like. And so I think for us, it's more about the demonstration of how we're doing the work and so just the numbers of people that we're reaching and continuing to accelerate that. So what that means for us is we have a program in Uganda, for instance, called Shelter Depot, which is really about a social enterprise model for entrepreneurs to be able to start these shelter depots, to be able to both rent or sell tools, hardware, equipment, construction materials for families coming into the refugee camp or families that have been living in the refugee camp to be able to either build a new home or upgrade their homes. And so there, we really look to measure, like, right, are these businesses self-sustaining? Are the entrepreneurs that are starting them, like, really making money? Are families, in fact, able to afford those products? Is the business model working for them? Are they building these homes? What does it mean when they have these new homes? And so doing that kind of outcomes measurement on some of the flagship programs that we're doing or on the initiatives that are much more designed by and created by Alight.
Are you extrapolating out at all in terms of like qualities that are created for these people or anything like that? Or is it more conservative, I guess, in sort of how you're able to project the difference that you're making?
I think we have more room to go. Like, I think if we had the resources, we would do a lot more. There are very few resources to real outcomes measurement in the humanitarian space. It's really quite different, actually, from the development space or from the sort of social enterprise space, where there's a lot of resources that go towards randomized control trials, towards big M&E efforts. And the humanitarian space is just really not the expectation. People don't track customers over time because it's built on this emergency response legacy. What that means is that it really is just about like, how many people have you seen? What's your effectiveness on that? And so to do anything else is really, it has to be self-initiated. And it's really hard to do that. It's like when you have the choice to raise money for impact evaluations or raise money for service delivery as a humanitarian organization, like you don't raise as much money for the impact evaluation, even though, of course, there are reasons why that could be valuable. But I just, honestly, it hasn't been like the main driver in our organization. I think for us, we know we're treating people differently. We're hearing that all the time. We know the implications of that. We get that qualitatively. Yes. Would it be compelling to measure? And if somebody gave me $2 million or $5 million, big impact evaluation, I would absolutely take it. But it's never for me risen to the top of this is my big fundraising priority. When on the other side of it, you're like, and millions of people in Sudan that like desperately need food today. It is a tension in the humanitarian space because I think if we want more donors to be compelled to invest and to believe that it's not just about these sort of like band-aid solutions or these sort of immediate needs today, but that this is actually systemically transformative, we probably do need to like at some point find the funders that want to invest in the outcomes evaluations in a more serious way.
If I'm hearing you right, it sounds like it's sort of the difference between like a MASH unit and like a hospital. Like, does this person have water? No. Okay, let's give them water. Cool. In some ways, a little bit self-evident. But I think it's also like part of the power in being clear about what's in, what's out. If Alight was focused on solving the war or fixing the political climate in Sudan, for example, you just wouldn't be as effective at some of the other stuff. So it's good to know just where you play and maximize that.
What's your lane, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I also think it was interesting what you said about having Alight be an example to others. When people talk about scale, you can talk about scaling the organization or scaling the impact, and they're not always the same thing. If you can document your process and what's been done and make that available to other organizations, they can then run with it themselves. It sounds like it's something you actively think about in terms of your annual strategy and the impact.
It is. I think we want to get it right and know that we've gotten that model right before we do a lot of sort of dissemination work. At the same time, I think we have done a lot and the work that we're doing now. So we've a piece of our strategy is really around having really deep insights about journeys of displacement. And we have a small team of folks that work on insights at Alight, and we invest in insights. And so this year, for instance, we've done a lot of insights work around what the implications of the foreign aid cuts have been to our customers on the ground. And so we've interviewed hundreds of folks in Kenya and Uganda and Rwanda to really understand like what's been different for them. And then we've been working to disseminate those insights. We've been doing briefings and webinars and working through communities of philanthropists and others to really showcase that insights work. So I think that's one example. I think another is that co-creation has been another important piece of our strategy. And really, we've developed a lot of tools around how to co-create in the context of humanitarian crises. And so we've, again, just done a number of webinars and workshops with folks at formerly USAID, the State Department, through Interaction and other communities of INGOs, through donor collaboratives. So really trying to spread some of the methodologies that we've developed, but also some of the sort of learnings that we have about working with displaced communities.
Yeah, I think it's an important philosophical point having to do with abundance versus scarcity, right? Because if the goal is to maximize the revenue and the work being done under a particular nonprofit brand, organization's brand, that's different than maximizing impact of the problems being solved, right? Maximizing the solutions rather than having it be connected to a particular effort, which goes to what you mentioned earlier about some organizations can end up being a place that guarantees good employment to their people rather than focusing on quality outcomes. So you mentioned some of the funding cuts. It's been a crazy time for the sector. USAID obviously was the big sort of newsy one, but there's just been a lot of cuts to federal funding grants in general. In addition to the refugee space, was our quota previous years like 125,000 refugees every year, cut down to 7,500. How's the current political climate impacting the work being done at Alight? And what are you seeing across the humanitarian space from other organizations that you partner with?
Yeah, the foreign aid cuts have been drastic. I think what the U.S. government has continued to prioritize around foreign aid has been humanitarian assistance. We've seen fewer cuts in the humanitarian space than certainly in the development space. I think the work that they've really focused on preserving is the sort of life-saving work. And so things like, again, we've been talking about the health clinics and feeding centers that we run in Somalia and Sudan and types of things are what is continuing to get support from the U.S. government. That said, we started this year with 5 U.S. government grants. We pretty immediately lost 2 of them. We had a program that we were running in Myanmar, which was around prevention and treatment for tuberculosis and malaria. And we were running a nutrition and protection program in South Sudan. Both of those lost funding, and we don't expect that we'll get that back. We have been able to maintain the other U.S. government grants that we had, the work that we're doing, welcoming refugees and running transit reception centers and providing protection services in Uganda, and the health and nutrition work in Sudan, and the work that we're doing on health and nutrition and livelihoods in Somalia. It's definitely been a challenging year. In addition, grants directly from the U.S. government to us, the U.S. government is also funding UN agencies at substantially lower levels as well. And as an organization that gets UN funding, there's sort of an impact of that as well. So we've lost maybe 15% of our funding so far this year, and had to make associated headcount cuts as well. But we could certainly stand to lose more. We really don't have an understanding at this point of what the process is for extensions or renewals or new grant funding. We're really waiting for kind of the new State Department offices to get settled and get those funding processes back underway. But we really don't expect that we're likely to see new funding until sometime in 2026 at this point. And then on the U.S. side, we haven't talked as much about our work in the U.S., but we have been working here for about 5 years to welcome refugees and newcomers. So we were part of a movement policy called Welcome Corps, which was really providing opportunities for everyday Americans to sponsor refugees to come to the United States. We did that with Ukrainians and with Central Americans and with Africans. And that program has been paused through this year. We are still working, though, with support from the state of Minnesota on providing sort of orientation and job opportunities and different forms of support to refugees who have come into Minnesota within the last couple of years. And that work continues. So we are still doing some work in the U.S. with new arrivals, and really just continuing to support communities, particularly Afghans, Ukrainians, Central and South Americans, and Africans who have come to the Twin Cities.
It seems like the future around government funding is, let's call it at this point, fairly unpredictable. How are you working to future-proof Alight to be resilient through whatever may come? I'm curious, what are you seeing your peers doing? And also, and you can take these one at a time. Sorry for lumping them all together, but how do you think about continuity for customers who may lose access to a program they've been depending on?
Particularly in those first few months when we really didn't know what was happening with foreign aid and what the future would be of the work that we were doing, we pretty immediately reached out to our private supporters, and we're really pretty successful in launching an emergency campaign where our private donors really stepped in and we were able to raise about $3.5 million. That really helped us get through that period of time. Alight is fortunate in that we have many everyday donors, people that donate $10 or $20 a year to people that donate $100,000 a year or more personally to the organization. But those sort of everyday donors and the folks that were giving us $50, $250, $500 at a time this year have just been critical support for us. And we hope that sort of going into the end of the year, we're able to see more giving around Giving Tuesday and around the holidays support for these crises. And Alight is continuing to raise into our emergency fund to allow us to respond to these crises that we're seeing around the world, Sudan, one in particular. I think what organizations are talking about right now is like, how do we see more operational efficiencies that could come through mergers and acquisitions, through forms of partnership, towards consolidating resources to be able to operate in more cost-effective ways. I do think that there's certainly a desire to secure more private funding, whether that's through corporations, private foundations, or individuals. I think it's a path to get there, though. It takes a while to really increase private giving, so it doesn't happen overnight, but I do think it's effective. And I think there are other donors. Unfortunately, many other European countries have also pulled back their funding over the past year. The UK and Germany, for instance, have both had pretty substantial cuts to their foreign aid budgets. And so it's not as if you could look to Europe and find a lot more support there. I think that's also quite challenging. I think there is some support that the Gulf provides and that we may be able to see there. We actually, just about a week ago, secured a pretty generous donation from Qatar to provide food aid to those in Darfur most in need. So we're optimistic about some new sources of funding, but also just recognize that the U.S. government, even at these declined levels, is still by far the largest funder of humanitarian assistance. And so there's just nothing else that's going to fill the gap of that. And so it does mean that we want to continue to work with the U.S. government in whatever form that takes, and that we're figuring out how to make that possible, and hope that, are just sort of waiting as they rebuild systems and structures and teams so that they can, again, be a partner to us.
Yeah. A couple of your larger private foundation supporters aside, have you seen philanthropy kind of change how they operate, or some of those foundations step up to try to fill that gap, or not really yet?
I think what we've seen is many foundations who are doubling down on their existing portfolios of grantees. So for us, for instance, we haven't seen as many new donors. I mean, we have on the individual side, but in terms of the foundation side, we really haven't seen that many new foundation supporters. But for our existing foundation supporters, we've seen many of them either take restricted gifts and unrestrict them, which has been really beneficial, or double down and provide a second gift in the same calendar year. So I think there's a lot more of that, which is that foundations are saying we can't fill this gap, but we can continue to support and support at an even higher level the organizations that we've already got due diligence on and qualified as deserving of our funding.
It's an interesting moment just in the sector with the increasing need and the increasing onus on larger foundations to step up.
Yeah.
It's kind of what we're working on at Altruist, but I'm curious to see what you're seeing in the space there. I also love that you brought up grassroots donors. That community, and Giving Tuesday in particular, is pretty close to my heart. Woodrow Rosenbaum has actually been on this podcast twice now. I want to call it out, partly just because I think it's an underappreciated community of folks and underappreciated revenue source, particularly for an organization of Alight size. It would be easy to overlook sort of the $5, $10, $20, $100 donors. How do you guys think about that community of donors? How do you engage with them? What is it meant for you as an organization? And how do you regard them uniquely versus some of your major funder supporters?
Our annual fund has been a real source of flexible support for us. This year, we've seen that certainly, but we see that every year. We've been around for a long time. I think the benefit of being one of the few organizations doing this type of work in Minnesota, or even in the Midwest, and about half of our sort of everyday donor base comes from Minnesota and Illinois. We are on the local public radio and television a lot talking about humanitarian crises. And I think people like to fund organizations, even if they're doing the work overseas, but the organization is based there. That really appeals to a lot of folks. So it's been a great donor base for us, and it really does give us the flexible funding, the unrestricted dollars that we need to be able to invest in innovation, to support crises as soon as they happen, to make it through these types of cuts or pauses in funding. So we have an annual fund team. We have a communications team. We do a lot in terms of both doing events for them, many in Minnesota, but also virtual events. We do a lot of physical mailings. We do a lot of briefings. We find volunteer opportunities for them, whether that's through advocacy phone calls or other ways for them to support the work. So it's definitely been an important investment that we've made, but we really feel like those folks have stayed with us. I think we often are surprised by really generous legacy gifts from people that have been donors of ours for decades. We've many folks that are giving to us on a monthly basis. And so it's been something that's been important to us. And I think we recognize that our communications I don't think they even really need to be that much different. I think the same types of stories that really touch people's hearts or make them believe in new possibilities, like whether you work for a foundation or a government or you are my next door neighbor, I think those stories are what inspire people to give. People give at the level of their own sort of ability. And so for some, that's a $10 or $50 gift. And for others, that's a multi-million-dollar gift. But I think the same sort of emotions or sentiments motivate people in either case.
Sure. And if you're early career, not a super high net worth individual, that $20 is equally meaningful to you as it is $100,000 might be to someone who's in a different situation.
Absolutely.
Are you or Alight in general, how are you guys engaging with artificial intelligence? Are you able to leverage AI in your work or not so much?
We are. I would say we're still sort of in the early stages of it, but I think we're definitely interested and motivated to do more. I mean, I think at this point, we're using it more internally as a tool to help us be more sort of efficient and effective with grant writing and
Hmm.
reporting and monitoring and evaluation and just communications and research and that sort of thing. I think that there's going to be an opportunity for us to, I hope we're able to raise some funding to allow us to make more internal investments to help automate more of our sort of processes, whether that's things around payroll or benefits or other kind of operational aspects of our work. And then I think there's really exciting opportunities is to really think about how it can be used to improve the way that we deliver services to our customers. So, it's sort of early conversations, but really interested in thinking about how we can use AI to really complement the nurses and community health workers and health professionals that work in our health clinics and our feeding centers in service of better sort of diagnostics and treatment options. So if you complement AI and the humans that you have, I expect we will be able to serve people even more effectively if our healthcare providers have the opportunity and benefit of using AI in their work.
I'm curious about some of your work with boards, particularly the value that you get from being on boards of different organizations.
Yeah, so I'm currently on the board of Airbnb.org and I have remained on the board of IDEO.org. I think it's great as a CEO to be on other organizations' boards. It really helps me learn how other CEOs are thinking about things and really grappling with challenges. It helps me see what sort of healthy and sometimes unhealthy board practices are in other organizations that I can make sure that I either avoid or bring back to my organization. In particular, the sort of connection with IDEO.org is there's been so much great partnership between IDEO.org and Alight for now the last 15 years that is also a way to just make sure that I'm continuing to stay up to speed on like the
Hmm.
best examples of what human-centered design social innovation really looks like in this space so that I can bring those back into a light. With Airbnb.org, they're providing temporary housing to people that have experienced displacement in their first 30 days. So whether that's people that have experienced displacement due to the LA wildfires, or at the time we had a big partnership with Airbnb.org to provide temporary housing for Ukrainians who were fleeing Ukraine. And so we actually set up a model where we trained Ukrainians to serve as guides and work at border crossing points and reception centers and train stations in Poland as Ukrainians were coming across the border. Our team members would ask them, like, tell us about yourself. What do you need? And anytime they would say, I need housing, I need a place to stay, we had millions of dollars of Airbnb credits over time. And we're able to put people into 30-day Airbnb stays wherever they wanted. So in Poland or Germany or Australia or Canada or wherever they could get to, we were able to provide them with up to 30-day stays. And so it was just such a dignified way to allow people to have that kind of break and respite after they had escaped like really horrific situations. Many of them had seen neighbors or family members die in front of them. They were terrified. And to just have a place to stay where they didn't have to be sharing bunk beds, where they would be able to bring their pet, where their kids could have their own bedrooms was just much more dignified way to be able to serve and provide for people than forcing them to go into these pretty rough shelter situations.
Yeah. All right. A couple just little questions for you, as we wrap up here. I don't normally ask this, but I'm curious, how do you personally measure your own success?
It's a good question. I think in a light, I've been the CEO now for almost 4 years to sort of look back and kind of think about like what's shifted, what's different than it was
Mm,
4 years ago, right? And like, does that feel like 4 years of worthwhile time and effort and energy? And so I think to me, it's more about comparing us to where we were as opposed to comparing us to other organizations that
mm,
we're successful. I think we're an organization that really prides ourselves on like charting our own path and therefore like measuring success against ourselves as opposed to like against something else. And then I think I do look at it based on what's the feedback that I'm hearing, right? Good and bad. But whether that's through performance reviews or like notes from executive session from the board or comments from colleagues or feedback sessions or town halls that we're doing, but like I do a lot of listening as a CEO to really like I ask a lot of questions, I try and engage with curiosity, really try and make myself as accessible as possible so that I get to hear both the good and the bad about what my leadership looks like and how I'm doing, and track my success to some extent through that feedback as well.
What are some other people or organizations that you think are just doing really great work that you want to acknowledge or advise listeners to follow?
Been really impressed recently by Give Directly. I've always been impressed by them. I think they have a very clear, simple model. I mean,
Hmm.
we are definitely a multi-mandate legacy organization that has been around and we do many different things. I think Give Directly does one thing really well. But I think I've been really impressed recently that they've really transitioned their model from Africa to the US, which I think is really interesting. I also think it's really interesting that they are now transitioning into the disaster space. I think they've really done like a development to humanitarian shift, to Africa to US shift. And so I think their leadership is just really able to like pivot and do things in really interesting ways. I think Last Mile Health is another organization that I've just always had a lot of respect for. They started off doing global health work in Liberia, working with the government and models of community health workers. And I think they've really found a way to scale their model and to work with governments in Africa to really provide quality community health services. And I think they have done really well at securing really large amounts of private funding, being able to use that, but also to have a model that doesn't require tons of infrastructure staff themselves. I mean, they are certainly a large organization, but they're really able to build off existing government systems of healthcare provision and really work to sort of up level the way that the governments themselves are delivering health services.
Good answers. I'm curious what keeps you personally motivated to keep doing this kind of work. I know it's challenging. It's a lot of long hours. You don't always get the direct thank you from the people who are benefiting from the programs that you're putting out there. What keeps you engaged and excited and active doing this type of work still at this point in your career?
Yeah. I mean, I think it really is about spending time with whenever I can with the customers that we serve or with my colleagues. We end up hiring a lot of folks at Alight that have lived experience with displacement. Just hearing their stories and hearing them share how they think Alight's work is meaningful, that they believe our approach to it is the right approach, and they're the ones with lived experience with displacement, like that, I think gives me a lot of energy and sort of belief in what we're doing. We were together in Minneapolis last week. Next week, we're going to be in Nairobi together for a week. And so really being closer to the places that we work and hearing from them and really getting more of sort of like a view into kind of the direct impact that we're doing. The purpose of the work that we do is really what motivates me. And I think the closer I can get to that, the more inspiring that is for me.
What for you is the path not taken? Apparently, you were almost an anthropologist. So, what might you be doing if not this type of work?
I'm not sure. I feel very committed to this work. I don't think there's another path that I would take that wasn't on this social impact path. I think the place where it could be applied, like I've worked much more broadly outside of the humanitarian context and worked in everything from like health equity in the US to digital financial services in India to social enterprises in East Africa, and then, into the humanitarian space. So I certainly think that there are other sort of impact areas in which I could work, but I can't really imagine a world in which I wasn't at least trying to find leadership roles in organizations that were ultimately working to make communities in the world a better place.
Lastly, how are people who are listening to this support you and the work of Alight?
And encourage folks to check out our website, wearealight.org. Follow us on social media. Also, We Are Alight. Sign up for our newsletter. That's where you can hear the latest and greatest about all the work that we're doing. And I think for anyone who is so inclined, we are certainly raising money into Alight's emergency fund now to support crises in Sudan and beyond, and just generally to support the 4 million people a year that we work with across the world.
All right. That's a good place to leave it, I think. Jocelyn, thanks so much for this. I'm sure it's not easy for you to find a couple hours in your schedule to devote to something like this, but I've really appreciated learning from you and hearing your stories. I just want to really acknowledge you for the hard work you're doing out there in the sector for people that are really very vulnerable and need the help.
Thanks so much, Mike. I really appreciate the opportunity. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, that's our show for today. Deepest thanks to Jocelyn for such a thoughtful and wide-ranging conversation. I think the thing that struck me most from today's chat was her practical, non-dogmatic, solutions-oriented approach to aid work. It truly is about solving the real problems faced by the people she and her organization serve, and doing so in a personal, authentic way. Her insights about the difference between reach and impact really resonated, that it's not about being the largest organization serving the most people, but about the depth of that service and about demonstrating what high-quality, human-centered humanitarian work actually looks like. And in a time when foreign aid is being slashed and organizations are scrambling for survival, Alight's commitment to innovation and co-creation feels both brave and necessary. The stories from the field, from creating pop-up nail salons, to engaging teenage girls about contraception, to establishing supply routes through 3 different countries just to reach families in Darfur, these aren't just logistics. They're examples of what happens when you truly believe that everyone has something to give, that optimism is a choice, and that proximity to problems leads to better solutions. If you're moved by Alight's work, please visit wearealight.org. They're currently raising critical funds for their emergency response in the Sudan, where 25 million people need humanitarian assistance. And remember, whether you can give $20 or $20,000, those contributions are equally meaningful and desperately needed. We have some great episodes dropping over the next several weeks. Hope you'll stick with us. Until next time, Cause and Purpose is a production of altruist.org. If you're interested in bringing more rigor, transparency, and humanity to your philanthropic strategy, we'd love to show you how our platform can help. Visit altruist.org to learn more, and visit the show notes at causeandpurpose.org. As always, thank you for listening. Keep centering the people you serve, keep choosing optimism even in dark times, and as Jocelyn reminds us, everyone has something to give. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next time.